If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The abandoned Apache camp lay quiet under the late afternoon heat. Strips of hide flapped weakly against the bent lodge poles, and the fire pit held only a few glowing coals. Ahina moved slowly between the scattered remains of what once served as home, checking the ropes, rearranging supplies, tightening knots that had loosened through long seasons of wind and dust. She had done this every day for years. It kept the camp standing, and it kept her steady. Ahina was 22, the youngest daughter of a respected Apache hunter. Her father had hidden her here during a raid, promising to return with the others once the riders passed. She remembered his voice clearly, even though 6 winters had come and gone since that day. She stayed because the promise mattered to her. If she abandoned this place, she feared their spirits would not find her. Yet with each season, the hope that had once guided her began to feel like a burden she could hardly carry. Her thoughts stayed sharp and guarded. She scanned the valley often, aware of how vulnerable she was. Nights were the worst. She slept lightly and woke at the smallest sound. The fear never fully left her. Fear that something would come from the dark, fear that she had waited too long, fear that her tribe had died and she was the last one left. But she did not allow fear to dictate her actions. Survival was her mission now. Staying alive until she knew the truth was the only path she trusted. As the sun sank lower, a dry wind swept through the valley, carrying dust that clung to her hair and clothes. She gathered the last of the firewood and crouched near the pit, lifting a small flame back to life. Her hands shook slightly from the rising storm. She did not want to face another night alone in harsh weather, but she told herself she had done it before and could do it again. Far from the ridge, a quiet rider moved across the open land. Elias Ward guided his horse with a controlled gait, watching the ground as much as the horizon. His coat was worn, his face shadowed with days of travel, and his movements carried the tension of someone who did not rest easily. He was a former ranch hand and part-time scout, a man who once traveled with 2 brothers who never returned from a border fight. Their deaths left him distrustful and heavy-hearted. He carried guilt for surviving the fight they didn't, and that guilt shaped every decision he made. Elias had no mission except staying ahead of the memories that troubled him. He followed quiet trails, helped strangers when the cost was small, and avoided towns where old conversations might force him to talk about things he preferred to keep buried. But when he noticed a thin trail of smoke rising from a camp that looked half-ruined, he slowed his horse. He hesitated, uncertain if approaching was wise. Helping people drew questions. Questions brought stories. Stories reopened wounds. Still, the fading smoke suggested someone struggling to keep a fire alive in worsening weather. Instinct pushed him forward. Avoiding others had never erased the guilt he carried, but helping sometimes made the weight feel less heavy. Ahina saw him first, a figure moving through the dust, tall in the saddle, hat pulled low. Her heart jumped with a sudden spike of fear. She stepped back toward the lodge, gripping the small knife she kept hidden in her hand. She studied him carefully, waiting for any sign of threat. But the rider kept his horse slow and his posture relaxed. When Elias came close enough for her to read his expression, she saw no aggression, only wariness and exhaustion. He dismounted with measured movements to show he meant no harm. She noticed the way he scanned the ground, the way his hand stayed near his coat but didn't grip the revolver underneath. He was cautious, not hostile. She lifted her water gourd and extended it toward him without stepping forward. Her decision surprised even herself. Offering water to a stranger was dangerous. But something in his exhaustion softened her fear. He accepted the water, nodding once with a quiet respect, and handed her a small strip of dried meat in return. Neither spoke at first. They studied each other instead. 2 people shaped by loneliness but not broken by it. The wind shifted sharply, pushing sand against the lodge and scattering loose coals from her fire. Ahina turned toward the shelter and held the flap open. She felt a knot of tension in her chest as she invited him in. She didn't usually trust easily, but she didn't want to face the storm alone, and Elias seemed like someone who understood the dangers of the land without misusing them. Inside, the air filled with dust and the dull roar of wind pressing against the walls. Elias sat across from her, close to the center pole. His breathing steadied as he watched the structure sway under the force of the storm. He wondered why she lived out here alone, but he didn't ask. He sensed the answer would carry pain, and he preferred to let her speak on her own terms. Ahina watched him carefully. His quiet presence unsettled her at first, yet she also felt a strange relief. For years, she had lived in silence. Sharing a small space with someone who didn't demand conversation eased a part of her she thought she had lost. Her mind continued racing. Who is he? Why is he here? Will he leave when the storm passes? Should I ask him to? But she kept her face calm. Elias felt something similar. He had spent so long avoiding people that this shared silence felt unexpectedly safe. Sitting inside a storm with a stranger should have raised his guard, yet he sensed no danger from her. She moved with discipline, with the self-sufficiency of someone who had survived hardships without calling for help. He recognized that kind of strength. It mirrored his own. The storm grew louder. The lodge creaked. Ahina tossed a small piece of wood into the fire and watched the flame rise. Elias glanced at her briefly, acknowledging the gesture. Neither smiled, yet the moment held quiet understanding. For the first time in years, neither of them felt completely alone. The storm weakened near dawn, leaving a thin layer of dust settled across the lodge floor. Ahina rose first, steady and alert, brushing sand from her blanket and checking the lodge supports with quick, practiced movements. She pushed the flap aside and stepped out into the pale morning light. The ground felt cool beneath her feet, and the valley lay quiet except for distant wind moving through the brush. Elias followed a moment later, scanning the horizon as if it were routine for him to check for threats before taking a full breath of the day. His eyes moved over the ridge, the open plains, the small clusters of sage. The controlled caution in his posture made sense now. He was a man accustomed to trouble, someone who had learned to read danger before it reached him. The storm had not unsettled him, but the unknown land around them kept him tense. Ahina watched him briefly, trying to understand what he saw in the empty valley. She wondered if someone might be following him, if he carried the kind of past that drew unwanted company. The thought raised her guard, but she didn't voice it. Instead, she checked the lodge exterior, tightening ropes that had loosened overnight. Elias stepped closer without being asked and began reinforcing the weaker poles with methodical care. He did not explain why he helped. He simply worked beside her with the quiet focus of someone who preferred action over talk. Inside her mind, questions pressed forward: why he traveled alone, whether he intended to stay beyond the morning, what kind of life pushed him into silent lands. But she kept them contained. Direct questions could provoke discomfort. She chose instead to observe him as he worked. When the lodge stood secure again, she walked to the small storage pit near the ridge and retrieved a handful of dried seeds and herbs. Elias followed at a short distance, stopping when he noticed the faint line of old footprints near the sandstone wall. He crouched and studied them. They were hers, light steps, deliberate placement, but they told him something she had not said. She walked this land with familiarity, not with the fear of someone who expected an attack. She knew every path, every hiding place, every shift of the wind. Ahina returned to him and offered half of the dried seeds. She watched him taste them with a measured caution, then nod in approval. The quiet exchange eased a tension she hadn't admitted she felt. She had lived alone for so long that any presence near her camp once felt like a threat. Elias had not given her a reason to fear him, and that steadiness allowed her to breathe in a way she had not done in years. As the morning warmed, Elias retrieved his canteen and saddlebag from where he had tied his horse behind a cluster of rocks. Ahina stepped closer, noting how he checked the animal's legs and gear with careful precision. His attention to detail explained something she had wondered through the night. He was not wandering aimlessly. He was searching for safe ground, avoiding crowded routes, staying ahead of something that troubled him deeply. She prepared a small fire to cook the game he had offered the night before. Elias cleaned the knife he used for dressing meat, and she noticed the small notch on its handle, worn smooth from years of use. A tool that belonged to someone who did not stay long in one place. While the meat simmered, she placed a bundle of herbs beside him and gestured for him to drink the broth once it was ready. He studied her face, not with suspicion but with a quiet curiosity, as if trying to understand why she offered care so easily. She sensed the question in his mind, whether he was burdening her by staying, but she wanted him to take the food, sharing what she had felt like the right balance between caution and trust. As they ate, Elias asked his first real question, his voice low and steady. "Is anyone expected here?" She shook her head once. The answer was simple, and it carried the weight of years. He accepted it without pushing further. The silence between them shifted, no longer the silence of strangers, but the silence of two people navigating each other with patience. After the meal, Ahina walked toward the narrow path leading to the ridge where she gathered water. Elias followed her partway, stopping when she slowed. She looked back at him, understanding that he respected her boundaries. She continued alone, dipping her gourd into the shallow pool tucked beneath the sandstone shelf. While filling it, she wondered what would happen when he finally rode away. The thought pressed against her chest with an unexpected heaviness. By midday, they had repaired tools, reorganized supplies, and gathered fresh wood. Elias showed her how to reinforce weak bindings using strips from an old saddle strap. She demonstrated how to track ground birds by the patterns they left in the dust. Their cooperation grew without either of them acknowledging it aloud. Toward evening, Elias prepared to check the further edge of the valley for signs of game. She stepped beside him, hand resting lightly on one of the lodge poles, and spoke quietly. "You should not go far before dark. The land shifts after the wind." Her tone held concern, not control. Elias studied her a moment, recognizing the sincerity in her voice. He nodded once and stayed close, circling only the safer portions of the terrain. When he returned, they shared the small fire again, close enough to feel the day settle around them. Ahina watched him from across the flames. His presence stirred a mixture of caution, curiosity, and something softer she had not felt in years. He watched her too, trying to understand how someone could survive alone for so long without letting fear crush them. Their unspoken questions lingered between them. Why she stayed here, why he traveled alone, what they each hoped to find or escape. Neither forced the answers. The night deepened, and both accepted that they were no longer navigating this land entirely alone. The fire burned low, and their silence remained steady, shaped by mutual respect rather than distance. The day had changed something between them, not with declarations but with small decisions. Working together, sharing food, staying close as the wind shifted. The camp no longer felt like a place for one, and neither of them seemed eager to leave. The quiet of the valley settled deeper as the evening cooled, and Ahina added a final piece of wood to the fire. The flames rose just enough to cast a steady glow across the lodge entrance. Elias sat nearby, sharpening a small hunting blade with slow, even strokes. The rhythm of the movement eased the tension in his shoulders, though his eyes stayed alert, tracking every flicker of movement beyond the firelight. Ahina studied him from across the fire, recognizing an unease she had sensed earlier but never addressed. He paid careful attention to the land, as if expecting something to appear from the dark. She had wondered whether someone might be following him, whether his presence brought danger to her camp, yet he never displayed the behavior of a man fleeing a pursuit. He moved with purpose, but not with panic. The time felt right to understand more. She picked up the small pouch of herbs she used for calming the stomach and set it gently beside him. He glanced at it, then at her, waiting for her to speak. When she asked whether his journey had a destination, his jaw tightened slightly before he offered a quiet answer. "No destination, just distance." She listened closely. His tone held no bitterness, only exhaustion, as if distance had become the only companion he trusted. She sensed that he was not running from men or the law. He was running from memories. Elias hesitated, then told her that he once traveled with two brothers, men he trusted more than anyone. He explained how a border fight had left them dead while he survived. The guilt had pushed him onto the road, unable to settle, unable to face the places they used to ride together. Speaking the words brought a tightening in his throat, and he looked away to steady himself. He did not cry, but the weight in his chest became clear. Ahina shifted closer to the fire, placing her hands on the ground between them, showing that she understood loss without needing to match it with her own story. Her presence softened something in him. He realized he had not spoken that truth aloud in a long time. In return, she told him about her tribe. She explained how her father hid her before a raid, promising to return once it was safe. She described the early seasons she spent expecting every sound on the horizon to be her family. Her voice stayed calm, but the long silence that followed revealed the depth of her grief. She did not paint the tale with sadness. She presented it plainly, as a truth she lived with every day. Elias listened with a quiet focus. The details answered a question he had carried since arriving: why she lived alone in a half-ruined camp. It had not been choice. It had been loyalty. She stayed because leaving meant surrendering the last connection to her family. Seeing her speak of it so steadily left him with a stronger respect for her strength. She had not collapsed under the weight of loss. She had reshaped her life around survival and waited until waiting no longer made sense. A heavy silence grew between them, but not the kind that separated people. It was the sort that carried shared understanding. When the fire dimmed, Ahina retrieved a small hide-wrapped object from inside the lodge. She unwrapped it carefully and placed it before Elias, a carved charm shaped like a small bird. She explained that it had belonged to her mother. She kept it close when fear threatened her resolve, sharing it was not meant as a gift, but as a sign of trust. Elias held it gently, feeling the shallow grooves in the wood, and returned it with the same care. Later, they prepared for night. Ahina positioned her sleeping blanket nearer the fire than usual. Elias noticed the shift and placed his bedroll on the other side, matching the distance she seemed to invite. They no longer sat far apart like strangers forced to share space. The gap between them had narrowed naturally, without a spoken decision. Before resting, Ahina stepped outside to check the valley one last time. She scanned the ridges for movement, confirming that no riders or threats approached. The sameness of the landscape reassured her. Upon returning to the lodge, she found Elias adjusting the fire for the night. His movements were steady but thoughtful, showing a care he had not demonstrated when he first arrived. She lay down and watched him settle onto his bedroll. The quiet inside the lodge felt warmer than it had in years. She expected to feel the old familiar anxiety, the fear of strangers, the unease of sharing a confined space, but it didn't come. Instead, she felt grounded. Someone else breathed in the same room, and the sound did not frighten her. Elias rested his head on his rolled jacket and allowed his eyes to close. His mind wandered to places he avoided: the rough night of the border fight, the last shouts of his brothers. But the images faded sooner than usual. The presence of another survivor, someone who understood isolation without explanation, loosened the grip of his memories. As the firelight flickered across the lodge walls, both of them drifted into a calm they hadn't known in years. They didn't plan for mourning, didn't shape expectations, didn't define their connection. They simply existed in the same quiet place, steady and unafraid. For the first time in a long while, neither wondered how they would face the next day alone. Morning light crept through the lodge walls, cutting across the dust that drifted lazily in the still air. Ahina woke first, rising quietly so as not to disturb Elias. His breathing was steady, deeper than before, as if the night had finally granted him rest instead of the tension he carried in his shoulders. She watched him a moment, noticing how the weight he bore showed less sharply on his face. The change surprised her. She had expected a man who wandered the valleys to remain guarded even in sleep. Yet here he seemed unburdened, if only briefly. She stepped outside and scanned the ridge. The valley remained empty, but she followed the tracks near the water source more carefully than usual. She remembered Elias's question from the night before, whether anyone was expected to arrive. Though she had answered truthfully, the lingering habit of caution still controlled her mornings. Today, however, she checked the land not only for herself but for him as well. If someone from his past ever appeared, she wanted to recognize the signs early. Elias stepped out a few minutes later, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. His eyes moved immediately toward the ridge, then to her hands, checking whether she carried tension or ease. Seeing her calm, he allowed himself a slow breath. They shared a brief nod before turning to their morning tasks. Ahina prepared a small fire, and Elias walked the perimeter of the camp with the quiet habit of someone who understood patrol work. He inspected the lodge structure again, not out of distrust, but because the storm had weakened some of the bindings they thought secure. He reinforced the ones showing wear and checked the stakes holding the hide in place. When he returned, Ahina handed him a cup of warm broth. Their communication had become simple, fluid, and precise without needing explanation. After the meal, Ahina picked up her water gourd and motioned for Elias to follow her partway toward the ridge. She stopped at a fork in the narrow path, one direction leading to the water source, the other leading to the trail her tribe once used. Elias waited behind her without stepping closer, giving her the freedom to choose her direction. She walked toward the water, aware that he watched her movements with respectful concern rather than suspicion. At the pool, she knelt and dipped the gourd into the clear surface. Her reflection rippled beneath the water, reminding her how many years had passed since she last stood beside her tribe. She no longer expected them to appear. The ache of waiting had dulled, but the absence remained heavy. With Elias nearby, she felt the weight differently, not lighter, but shared in a way she could not explain. When she returned to the camp, she noticed Elias sorting through his saddlebag. For a moment, her chest tightened with the possibility that he was preparing to leave. She paused, watching him remove a length of worn rope and a few metal tools. Relief washed through her when she realized he was repairing his gear, not packing it. Still, the thought lingered. If he decided to ride on, she wouldn't have the right to stop him. That uncertainty settled into her stomach with an uncomfortable steadiness. He approached with the rope in hand. "Your lodge supports would hold stronger with a crossbeam," he said quietly. She nodded and walked with him to gather two straight branches. They worked together alongside the lodge, lifting the beams into place and securing them tightly. The structure grew sturdier with every knot they tied. The teamwork exposed an unspoken truth. Neither of them planned to treat this as temporary. They worked as if they intended to remain here longer than a single night or passing storm. Later in the day, Elias examined the ground near the fire pit, noticing faint tracks he hadn't seen before. They were fresh, light, and clustered in a small group, ground birds passing through, not a threat. But the sight stirred a question in him that had grown since he arrived. "How far does game travel through here?" he asked. Ahina explained that the valley could sustain small game, but not enough for long-term living. If she stayed here, she survived through rationing, foraging, and long trips to gather food. Elias absorbed the information with a quiet seriousness. It answered a question he'd carried since their first meeting: how she had managed to survive here for so many years. Elias offered to scout further for larger game before dusk. Ahina nodded, but there was a hesitation in her eyes he hadn't seen before. She wasn't afraid of danger. She was afraid he wouldn't return. Before he left, she handed him a small piece of dried root wrapped in hide. "For pain," she said. The gesture carried more meaning than the words. It showed trust, caution, and an unspoken request for him to come back safely. While he was gone, she cleaned the inside of the lodge, reorganized her tools, and prepared herbs to dry. She tried to focus on her tasks, but her thoughts drifted toward the ridge where he had disappeared. She had grown used to living alone. She knew how to endure silence. But this silence felt different. It felt like waiting for something that mattered. Elias returned before nightfall, carrying two rabbits and a calm expression. He approached the camp with unhurried steps, and Ahina felt a quiet relief settle into her chest. She didn't show it outwardly, but the tension in her shoulders eased. They prepared the meal together, working in synchrony. Elias cleaned the rabbits while Ahina set up the fire and herbs. When they ate, they spoke briefly about the land ahead, places where water would be easier to find, where storms hit less severely, where a lodge could stand without constant repair. Ahina listened to him describe the sheltered valley he had once passed during winter. The details: steady grass, clear water, a cliff that protected from strong winds, painted a place she could imagine living without fear of losing everything to weather or isolation. She lowered her gaze, thinking through a decision she had avoided for years. Leaving this camp meant accepting that her tribe would never return. She had known the truth for a long time, but she had never acted on it. Now, with Elias beside her, the possibility of leaving no longer felt like abandoning her family. It felt like choosing a life that allowed her to breathe again. She looked up and found Elias watching her with a calm, patient expression. He wasn't urging her to speak. He wasn't pushing her toward any choice. He simply waited, offering a quiet stability if she needed it. That night, when the fire burned low and the valley settled into silence, Ahina finally said what she had carried in her chest for far too long. "I don't want to stay here anymore." Elias didn't ask for explanations. He nodded once, accepting her decision with the same quiet strength he had shown since the moment they met. In the morning, they would decide where to go. But tonight, they rested beside each other as two people no longer tied to past promises, only to the choices they were ready to make together. Dawn settled over the valley with a muted warmth, soft enough to ease the transition from night, but clear enough to mark the beginning of a new direction in their lives. Ahina stepped out of the lodge first, feeling a steadiness in her chest she had not known in years. Elias joined her moments later, tightening the last strap on his saddle and securing the tools he had repaired the day before. Neither spoke, but both understood that the place they stood in no longer held their future. Ahina took a slow breath and looked at the land she had guarded for most of her life. The familiar shapes of the rocks, the worn trail leading to the ridge, the old fire pit. They no longer felt like anchors but remnants of a chapter finally closed. Elias watched her expression carefully, ready to give her time if she needed it, yet she showed no hesitation. She had grieved here, survived here, and waited here. Now she was ready to walk forward. They packed only what they could carry. Ahina chose her mother's charm: a few tools, herbs, and blankets. The rest she left behind intentionally, letting the land reclaim the camp naturally. Elias helped secure her belongings on his horse, giving her the steadier mount for the journey to easier ground. Before leaving, Ahina approached the trail her tribe once used. She stood there long enough to acknowledge the promise she had lived by, the hope she had held until it no longer served her. Her chest tightened with a brief, sharp ache, love for the family she lost, acceptance of the truth she carried, and a final farewell to the version of herself who had waited for so many seasons. When she turned away from the trail, she felt no pull to look back. Elias led them south toward the sheltered valley he had described. The path wound through narrow passes and open flats, each stretch revealing land untouched by storms. As they rode, he remained alert yet calmer than usual, relieved that she had chosen a direction rather than a burden. Ahina kept pace beside him, not behind. Their movements aligned naturally, as if they had traveled together far longer than a handful of days. A few hours into the journey, they stopped by a stream to rest the horse and refill their water. Ahina crouched by the edge, studying the clarity of the water and marking the small footholds where the ground was safe. Elias watched her work with a quiet admiration. She moved with purpose, with a steady grip on the land, as though she was reclaiming a strength she had kept dormant during her years of waiting. He knelt beside her, washing dust from his hands. The silence between them felt settled now, not tentative. There were no lingering questions about whether he would stay or whether she wanted company. Their shared direction had answered those doubts. When they reached the valley near midday, Ahina paused at the ridge overlooking the basin. The land stretched wide, filled with clean water, scattered trees, and soft grass that shifted gently in the wind. The cliff wall rose behind the basin, offering protection from storms. She scanned the terrain with the instinct of someone who had learned survival through observation. The valley offered everything she had lacked: safety, shelter, and the possibility of building something grounded. Elias watched her take in the view. He didn't ask for her approval. Instead, he waited with the quiet confidence of someone who trusted her judgment. After a long moment, she stepped forward and nodded once. The valley was suitable. It felt right. They descended together and began choosing a location for their lodge. Ahina picked a small rise near the water where the soil was firm. Elias gathered straight branches from the tree line, testing each for strength and flexibility. When they built the frame, their movements synced seamlessly, as if the structure were the natural extension of the partnership forming between them. Ahina stretched the hides across the frame, smoothing them with precise hands. Elias shaped a fire pit from river rocks, packing the base with sand to keep the heat contained. They spoke only when necessary, each understanding the other's intentions through simple gestures and focused work. By evening, the new lodge stood solid and prepared for the coming nights. The fire crackled inside the entrance, casting warm light across the interior. Ahina arranged the blankets on one side and placed her mother's charm above, where they would sleep. Elias hung his tools near the doorway for easy reach. Their lives, once separate and shaped by isolation, were now aligned by shared purpose. They ate their first meal in their new home, fresh rabbit cooked slowly over the fire. Ahina leaned her shoulder gently against Elias, testing the closeness without forcing it. He shifted slightly to support her against him, his breathing steady, his guard lowered in a way she had never seen before. For a brief moment, she felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by the grounding comfort of companionship. Elias felt the same. His memories no longer pulled him backward with the same force. The land around them held space for something new, something built with patience and trust rather than grief. Outside, the valley settled into the quiet of night. Inside, the lodge felt warm and lived in, as if it had sheltered them for years instead of hours. Ahina rested her head lightly against Elias's shoulder. He placed his coat around her without a word. She reached for his hand, and he let her hold it, steady and certain. Their breaths fell into a calm rhythm. No storms waited beyond the ridge. No ghosts of the past climbed their way into the valley. For the first time in both their lives, the future felt open and safe, something chosen, not endured. They stayed together in that quiet, knowing they had finally reached a home where neither of them would stand alone again.